SG's seminar. Okay, recording in progress. SG's seminar titled Career Trajectories and Earnings Gap in the Government, Evidence from Research. My name is Breno Braga, and I'll be co-hosting the seminar with Mel Sachs, who is here, and who has, I just learned, has been doing this since 1976, so he knows, he knows what he's doing. So before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. We'll take 5 to 10 minutes to introduce the seminar and our speakers. And then each speaker will have 25 minutes for their presentation. And then we'll reserve the final 20, 30 minutes for Q&A session, the final ones. So during the presentations, I ask everyone to keep your microphones muted. For the Q&A section, if you have a question, there's 2 things you can do. The first thing is you can raise your hand virtually, and I'll call you by your name, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. And alternatively, you can also type your question or comment in the chat box, and I'll read it out loud for the speakers. We're also recording this presentation, and we'll make it available online, as well as the slides that the presenters will use. But before we start, let me move. Is my slide moving? No, it's not. Oh, yeah, here. But before we start the presentation, I want to advertise our society in case this is the first time you're joining one of our seminar series. So our mission is SG supports professional development of government economists and economists interested in the economics of public policy. The way we do this, the way we achieve this goal is through many activities that we have throughout the year. So we have monthly seminars like the one that you're participating now. We also have our annual conference, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And also we sponsor sessions in other conferences as well. We also have many leadership opportunities for government economists and those interested in public policy. So keep an eye out for our upcoming election for new board members in April. We also have networking and mentoring opportunities, which we announce in our website, so stay tuned for those. Just to advertise our upcoming seminars, in October, we're going to have Sabrina and Emma, October 4th. We're going to have Sabrina and Emma talking about heterogeneity in remote work and flexible workplace practices. And then in November 7, we're going to have Danny talking about labor unions. We also have 6 SG sponsor sections in the 2025 ASSA meetings in San Francisco. So I invite everybody who will be in San Francisco for that conference to attend those sessions. And then finally, we have our annual SG conference, which next year is going to be hosted at the American University Washington College of Law here in Washington, D.C., and it's going to be on April 4th. So stay tuned in our website for the call for papers for that conference. And with that, I'll pass to Mel to present the speakers. Mel, you have to unmute yourself. You're muted, Mel.
Merit Rehavi is an associate professor at the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia. Her research analysis, expert decision-making, and the exercise of discretion in medicine, criminal law, and employment, hiring, compensation, and promotion. Prior to arriving at UBC, she was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Scholar in Health Policy Research at the University of Michigan and received a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Pleased to present Merit Rehavi.
Thank you very much for having me. I am very, very excited to get feedback from everyone here about this work, since all of you are far closer to the things we're studying than I am, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the things we missed and, more importantly, got wrong. Let's see if this is going to control. There we go. It should be in presenter mode now. Oops, okay. So I'll be talking more broadly about the literature on what we know about how people progress through their careers and the role of managers in this. But the work I'll be talking about that's my own is joint with Nicole Fortin and Mila Markevich. Mila is one of our amazing PhD students who is on the job market this year. So there's been a lot of research, we're certainly not the first, on the gender gap in the US in pay. And the good news is it has considerably decreased over the last 40 to 50 years. But there's a pretty big unexplained gap that's unexplained by what we call employee side factors. So unexplained by workers' education, attachment to the labor force, other ways in which male and female workers now look much more observationally equivalent than they did in, say, 1970, right? And recent research has really shifted from thinking about what is it that female employees do differently to thinking a lot about what is it that's different about the firms. So firm side factors, so David Card and Pat Klein have a paper about the underrepresentation of women in high productivity firms. So the firms that pay the most are the least likely to kind of have the fewest female employees. There's been a lot of interest in kind of macro level policies like women on boards of directors. California had that quota law. They frankly have had small effects, at least in the short run, if any. Aggregate work on female management shares at the firm as a whole and critical masses of women among sort of C-suite leadership. More recently, though, in the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of really high quality longitudinal data within firms, where you see every worker in a firm and you see them over many years and you see their matches to management teams, and you can actually really trace out their labor market trajectories. And some of this has been federal data sets like the LEHD. Others have been private firms opening up their data, or payroll management firms that firms use, allowing workers to use the data for lots of firms. And this has led to a lot of empirical research, getting under the hood in firms and really looking at what goes on, looking at the role not just of things that we can observe in aggregate data, like whether there's a female CEO or people on the board, but really looking individually at each worker's individual experience, whether that worker had a manager of a certain type, how they progressed through the firm. And one of the things that's come out of this data is probably not surprising. In general, women are less likely to have managers that look like themselves. And so in the federal government, which is the data we'll be looking at, 60% of men's new managers were men, but only 40% of women's new managers were women. And there's a lot of evidence that these manager-employee relationships and the social distance really matters. We'll be focusing on gender, and most of the literature does, largely because of observability. So obviously things like race and other things are, if anything, probably have even larger effects, but firms, including the federal government, are very, very hesitant to release that race data because I think they view it as much more sensitive politically. So even the FOIA data that we're using and lots of other researchers are using on the federal payroll system does not include race, and they will not release race. Lots of us have tried. So we would love to do the intersectionality of race and gender. Everyone thinks this effects are probably, if anything, larger for race. The federal service would be a great place to study that. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get that variable. So with that caveat, there's lots of evidence that social distance with immediate supervisors matters. Cullen shows that if you and your manager who rotates into your team are both smokers, you get promoted faster and get better performance evals. Your idea being that you're having more face time, spending time smoking outside on a smoking break. Lots of evidence that in general, having a match, and many of our social connections and a lot of the ways that society is still organized tend to be around gender. So you can imagine, who you're eating lunch with, who you're just sort of more naturally grabbing coffee with. And there's a lot of work that shows managers can impact career trajectories and really matter. So managers do things like assign promotable tasks. There's sort of the office housework that someone has to do, and then there are the tasks that give you the opportunity to get a higher score on service to the organization and otherwise sort of make yourself be seen. Who decides who gets those tasks is usually your immediate supervisor. And even if they're not assigning the task, they may be advertising the opportunity to participate in the task. Similarly, they're obviously doing your performance eval, making decisions all the time in sort of a Bayesian way. Is that an honest mistake anyone would have made, or is it a signal of this worker's ability or effort? All of those kind of subjective decisions, there's a human component too, and they have big effects on careers. And we know from the literature that differential promotion rates, particularly early in one's career, are a big contributor to the gender gap. And so the question is, what role does sort of what manager you happen to draw early on in your career have on your career trajectory? Okay. And, this is also, I'd say, part of a larger, not just race and gender, but there's also been a big interest looking at the federal civil service that historically, personal connections, historically, I mean the 1800s, recent work showing personal connections kind of substitute for costly monitoring. And when things are difficult to observe, you're more likely to rely on a personal connection and someone you know or have ties with, went to the same school with, to substitute for the unobservability of effort. So this was true in outlying areas in the US railroad and civil service in the 1800s, before the railroad was built, when it was really hard to kind of know what was going on in the West. And similarly, more recently, if you think beyond gender and race, there's been work on political alignment. So using this same FOIA payroll data, Sprenchik, Tesso, and Shu matched the procurement office data on whether contracts that they were supervising were completed on time and on budget, and found that that was more likely to be the case if the person supervising the contract had the same voter registration as the president's party in office. And they're using kind of same person, but changes in the president's political affiliation, and they find changes in what they're going to call productivity. So we think that in a lot of ways, and I think that emphasizes something that's really important, that will be a limitation of the work I'm about to tell you a little more about that's mine, which is whenever we're seeing the effect of a match, whether it's by ideology, gender, race, all we're seeing is the match effect. And I can't say, is it that the manager is behaving differently or the employee is, right? We're going to be attributing this to managers, just like they're attributing this. But, it may be the case that I am more likely to advocate for myself when I have a female manager. It may be that I communicate better and therefore am more productive, right? There are a lot of ways in which these match things could go either way. Anytime you're talking about a human relationship, there are two sides to it. And we're not going to be able to tell you who's kind of responsible for the difference. We're just going to be able to tell you there is a difference. Okay. So what have we done? Well, we have got the FOIA data that I think lots of researchers are now using, that got released originally by BuzzFeed, and then lots of us have done sort of subsequent FOIAs to expand it, that covers 30 plus years. Over, as you know, we're going to focus on white collar workers. As of 2013, there are about 700,000 white collar federal workers, spread across thousands of offices in the United States, with a wide range of industries and occupations. This is something you all know because you work in the federal government, but when I'm talking to people less familiar with the US federal government, everyone just thinks of kind of offices and don't think the wide range of occupations. But we like the federal service as a study setting because we think this is sort of the best case scenario for these effects not to matter and for deterministic pay to work. And so I view this as, if you find these effects here, they are probably much worse in the private sector. And also really valuable here because we're able to see kind of a really long period, not just one employer, not just one industry, but we're going to be able to see a range of different occupations and types of jobs. And that's going to be really important because we're going to find that these match effects matter a lot more for certain types of work. And you can't see that when you only have sort of one firm's data. But, you know, we think these are also going to be kind of the best case scenario for deterministic pay to work, for these subjective human interaction factors to be minimized, both because you have the HR system with OPM, a very strong union monitoring compliance, lots of regulations, fairly standardized jobs and hours compared to the private sector. And you don't have things like the profit motive that you brought in a big client and you're getting a share and rewarded from the profits of that client, like you might have in the law firm or something. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of estimate the causal effect of managerial homopoly, having a manager of the same sex, on employee pay and promotion in the civil service. And we're going to use an event study with the appointment of a new manager at the office. So we're going to be focusing on small offices. So all of you, if you're in Washington, you're not in this data in our estimation sample, because what we're going to do is we're going to say, look, a new manager arrives at your office. For half the employees, that manager will be the same sex. For the other half, there'll be an opposite sex manager. And so we'll be looking within the office, what happens to the employees who are the same sex as the new manager versus the employees who are not, and matching. And with that, because we'll be looking, we're worried about people reshuffling and interpersonal kind of matching. So we'll only be looking at a manager arriving, joining the managerial team at the office. And so because of that, we're going to look at small teams and small offices. So up to 5 managers, think about 50 employees in the physical office. If we were looking at, and we've done it, you know, if we have 20 managers in an office and you change one manager, that's not going to have a big effect on the average employee. And so we do get this dose response. So we're going to focus on the smaller offices where we have kind of a more concentrated treatment. What that means is headquarters basically aren't in here. So you should think of these as much more the non-DC smaller offices. And we're going to, so with that, what do we find? So female employees benefit more from getting a same-sex manager. This really matters for women. And we see large increases. Their wage growth is much faster, but not just their wage growth, their progression through the GS steps and levels is faster when a new same-sex manager arrives. So the male and female employees are bumping along. We have really good balance in the pre-trends, and then a new same-sex manager arrives and we see faster wage growth, faster progression through the GS scale. We also see things like occupational upgrading and other things. And what we find though is this doesn't happen for everyone. This is really concentrated in employees with less routine jobs. And that's even true after controlling for education. So even if we look within high ed or lower ed workers, these effects of managerial homopoly and match really matter for workers in less routine jobs within those educational categories. And those are the jobs you might think of as having both multitasking, where there's more kind of managerial assignment of tasks, but also it's harder to observe productivity, right? That these are less routine jobs, there's more subjective evaluation potentially of the quality of work, okay? And so we sort of say, look, even in this incredibly structured administrative system, you're still seeing pretty big and immediate effects of these matches. Okay. So very briefly, data we're going to stop before the Trump administration. There was a huge amount of turnover in 2016 in the federal service, and that was probably not random turnover. And so we're going to stop kind of in 2014. We have the OPM data. We imputed gender, sex from name, but there's a subsample of data that's available that has actual self-identified sex in it, and we have really high matches on accuracy within those subsamples. Just in the interest of balance, we're going to limit it to white-collar employees. There are many fewer women in non-white-collar jobs. And we're going to exclude law enforcement and regulatory agencies because their data is redacted in a lot of ways that are problematic. Okay, so that means like the Inspector General's office in every government agency is out, basically. We're going to need workers to stay at least 5 years. We're going to see them from the first day, but if someone's only there for a year, we're not going to really be able to do an event study before or after with them. So we want kind of stable workers. And we're going to be also workers born after 1955 because we want the beginning of our data to capture the beginning of their careers. And we want to see a whole career for people. Okay. So with that, I'm going to skip all of this. And just to give you a sense of what we're looking at across offices, 50% of offices have 5 or fewer managers. On average, there's kind of an employee-manager ratio going on, on average, it's about 10 to 1 manager. We'll be looking at smaller offices. So this is going to be most of the offices, but not most of the employees, because obviously the bigger offices, there are fewer of them, but they have a lot of federal employees. Okay. And so our event of interest, to be really clear, is the first time an employee experiences the arrival of a new manager. We've looked at second and third managers, but you want to line things up because of path dependence. So for just cleanliness of the estimates. And so the idea is the event is a new manager arriving at the office, and the treatment is that manager being of the same sex as the employee. So this is kind of a triple difference. Okay. And these are intent to treat estimates. If you think that all that matters is the manager directly supervising you, but they're also overall estimates. So then you want to multiply by 5. On the other hand, if you think that having someone just in the management leadership team, even if they're not your manager, you can ask them advice, get information, then this is the effect, not as intent to treat, of having a manager at your office. Okay. Okay, and so this is the main results. So what you have here is we're showing you on the left in the blue and orange, what happens to female employees when a female manager arrives and male employees when a male manager arrives. So the orange is female, and the purple on the right is the differential effect. So you can see that everyone's wages are growing over time. Men's and women's are kind of growing the same rate. There's common trends early in their careers. That's just progression in the way the GS step system works. But then the difference is the purple that we've done for you with the standard errors. And you can see that female managers have much faster wage growth, female employees when a female manager arrives. And we did it by quarter to make the graphs easier. We're going to show them to you by year since they arrived, which is just what the bottom is, just to make them easier to read with fewer dots on the graph. And so you can see that within about 3 years of a new manager arriving, female employees are going to experience wage growth that's about 1.5 log points higher than male employees in the same office with the same manager. Okay. And just so you know, there's no effect prior to a new manager arriving. We have really good balance. You saw that in the pre-trends. And what I want to show you is all of these effects are really concentrated. You'll see it looks like it's concentrated in, this is the same difference, but for high ed workers, which is the solid line, workers with at least a bachelor's degree, we see really flat, no effect, no differential homophily effect for workers with less than a bachelor's degree. But this isn't really coming from education, it's coming from the routineness of occupations. So if you look at less routine jobs, that's the big line spiking up in purple. Those are male and female, the difference between male and female employees in less routine jobs. And you can see that's a really big effect. And if you look even within those without a bachelor's degree, you get the same effect for those with less routine jobs. So this really isn't education, it's about the nature of work and its evaluation. And what's important about that is if you think over time, less routine jobs are becoming a larger share of federal employment over time, both because routine things have been outsourced and because technology is replacing a lot of routine clerical work. And what that means is this kind of explains why over time this gender gap has been really persistent and not going away as women have gotten more education and moved into these roles, because women are essentially moving into jobs where their gender is going to matter more in terms of evaluation. So as you get women moving into these less routine jobs, having more careers, you have more women in this critical mass, but they're also moving into the areas where evaluation is more subjective and where identity is going to matter more. And that's probably only going to go forward even more as we get AI and other things kind of replacing a lot of tasks. Okay. This is not a historical accident. This exists across presidential eras. And what I'll tell you is any differences you see over time are actually coming from changing shares of routineness as opposed to actual changes across time. So one of the things, if we had more time, I'd show you, but this is all really being driven by the evolution of work and changes in routineness. It's not that we've gotten better at this over time or worse, as it may be. You'll notice the Obama administration was the outlier. This period is when there was the massive pay freeze, among other things, and freezes on promotions and other things for about 2 years, and that dampened everyone's wage growth. And obviously, if no one's wages are growing, you're not going to have differences in wage growth be as big. So that's kind of what's going on there. We can also see this more directly. You're seeing GS grades. Women are moving up faster through the GS grades when they have a same-sex manager, which mechanically almost has to be true if they're getting higher wages in the federal system. And we're seeing about a 10% increase in the speed at which they move through grades. We're also seeing occupational changes. So they're moving into occupations that are related but higher coded. Some of this could be reclassification by the manager, getting kind of the job upgraded. Some of it could be helping workers get additional skills that let them qualify for different roles. We don't see any big differences in office switching or attrition by gender with this, something we were worried about. That's pretty much a zero. And so, what do we conclude? Even in this really highly deterministic system that's kind of set up to be the best chance for these things not to matter, we're still finding that women's career trajectories vary with the identity of their manager, or not even their own manager, but sort of the arrival of a female manager at their office, in a small office. And this is going to increase both wages and GS grades. And, this is really being driven by why we think it's about evaluation is these less routine jobs. Okay. So I'm going to end there. I'm looking forward to all of you telling me everything we missed or should look at, since all of you are much closer to me. And please, if we got something wrong, tell us now. And thank you for the chance to share this with you all.
Thank you, Merit. We'll have questions after both speakers, if that's okay. Danelle Sandler works as a labor and urban economist at the Census Bureau Center for Economic Studies. She received a bachelor's degree in economics from UC Santa Barbara in 2007 and a PhD from University of California, Davis in 2012. Her current research interests include female employment and the motherhood penalty, post-incarceration labor market outcomes, residential mobility, and diversity in the economics profession. I'd like to introduce you to Danelle Sandler. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. I will get my screen up. All right. So yes, thank you all for being here. I'm excited to share some of this work. So I'm Danny Sandler. I at the Center for Economic Studies at the Census Bureau. I'm also the vice president of the Society of Government Economists. So this presentation is mostly in my census hat, but I encourage you all to join SGE in my SGE hat. All right, so before I begin, I start with my disclaimer. So these are my opinions and not those of the Census Bureau, and everything I show you has been approved for release. All right, so I'm going to talk about 3 different papers today, and I'm focused on PhD economists. And so thinking about how this relates to the presentation we just saw, our papers focus on the economist market in general, but I'm going to sort of highlight the results that deal with the government economists. And government, the occupation of economists in the government is going to be very related to what Marie was showing. It's a less routine job, and the economics profession is male dominated. So at least if we were employees and managers were randomly distributed, women would be more likely to work for a male manager in this profession. I don't think they are randomly distributed. I think people there's selection there, but in general, there are more men than women in the economics profession. And so this comes from, as I said, 3 different papers. This is joint work with Lucia Foster and Erica McEntarfer, and also Julia Manzella. And so we use data on all PhD economists and look across different sectors. And so I'm going to start by just giving sort of a lay of the land on the economics profession. In the economics profession, so a PhD economist, historically, most have entered academia. We have looked at this over our data started in 2001. So in 2001, it was almost 2/3 of the new economists entered academia, and that's been falling over time. And I think this is part of a sort of falling trend. I think if we looked even before 2001, we would see even more economists entering academia as their initial placement. But now it's just over half of economists enter the academia, and the others are going elsewhere. And so where are they going? Some of them, there's some going into the private sector, both consulting firms and technology firms, but there's a large growth in government economists. And so it's sort of an interesting sector to look at when we are interested in the economics profession and changes in the economics profession over time. So to give us a sort of snapshot of who's in the economics profession, as I said, and we all know that it's male dominated. So sure, 2/3 of economists are men, 1/3 are women. There's actually pretty even distribution of sex and race racial groups across the 3 industries, but there is some variation. So like the government economists are 38% female, whereas in academia it's 32%. There's also a higher percentage of Black and Asian economists in the government relative to academia. But there's sort of all groups are entering in all 3 sectors. The one notable exception is there are a lot fewer temporary residents in the government, which makes sense because a lot of agencies are not able to hire temporary residents. So sort of think about this, so Marie was mostly looking at earnings inequality and growth in the occupations. So just to think about earnings across these 3 sectors, Let's see. So when at initial placement, earnings across all three sectors are relatively even. The industry pays more. But so in government, government on average it pays more than academia. And industry pays more than both of them. And specifically, the gap between government and industry is 85%. So the average economist working in the government earns 85% of what economists that start in industry to earn. And that ratio is 77% for academia. And then if we look at growth over time, so 10 years after PhD, those that are in industry have much higher earnings than all the government or academic economists on average. The government still earns a little bit more than academic economists on average. For all three sectors, there's a long right tail. So there's some that individuals in all three sectors that are doing very well relative to the average. And that's sort of characteristics that's sort of most emphasized in industry, but is true in all three. So that's sort of the lay of the land. And so what I want to sort of dive into next is sort of talking about inequality amongst economists, both in the government and out of the government. So, and I think something that's happened recently, and our research was we put it all out before this, but recently the there's been a salary history ban for federal government employment, and so what this does is that when we hire new economists, whether they are as the initial placement when they get their PhD or a more senior hire, we cannot consider their like any earnings prior to their government employment. So that this is a so we cannot, yeah. So this just went into, like, it was just passed in January, and so we sort of have yet to see what it does to pay and recruitment. To talk about what could happen is that there is some research on salary history bans, not in the federal government. So there's some work on sort of local bans, and in general, these find that wages are sometimes depressed, but they do see increases in earnings of women relative to men. So the gap in offered earnings does shrink. So the salary history bands sort of distort the market, but they do at least satisfy the goal that they are, the reason they are implemented. So what do we, I'm sort of going to use the research we did on earnings inequality in the government to talk about what I think will happen with this salary history ban. And to start with, our earnings in the government are actually pretty equal between men and women. So women at both the median and the 75th percentile earn about 88% of what men do. So it's not equal, and you can see those distributions of earnings do not overlap. Have a sort of large area of non-overlap. The peaks are at different levels, but they are sort of better than the sort of national average earnings gap. And if you look 10 years later, the gap at the median has grown, but the gap at the higher or no, the gap at the median has shrunk, and the gap at the 75th percentile has stayed constant. So for government economists, the gap at initial placement isn't huge, and it shrinks over time. And just to contrast that to other things going on in the market, so in academia, the gap at 10 years after PhD is 79% of the 50th percentile and 86% of the 75th percentile. So the gaps are bigger. In academia, they are actually very similar in industry with different patterns. So that's gender gaps. What we are able to do that Marie mentioned they are not able to do is to look at intersectionality. So what does it look like by race? What does it look like by gender and race? So for this, we have a population of just economists that worked in the federal government at some point. And so we can look at their earnings before they entered the government and after. And so we sort of see a pattern that would suggest the salary history ban could be beneficial. The earnings before these economists enter the federal government are very unequal. And they do equalize a lot when they enter the federal government, though some groups still seem to be left behind, particularly the underrepresented minority men and underrepresented minority women. And we've pooled Black, Hispanic, and other race, American Indian, Alaska Natives into the underrepresented minority group. And then post OPM, we see sort of some gaps opening up again, though it is more equal than the pre-OPM. A lot of the differences in earnings within OPM are going to be driven by where people work. So like the financial regulators are going to pay a lot more than statistical agencies. So we do control for that. So this is the OPM. So the third dot here controls for the agency or industry outside of OPM that people work for. And then the middle dot, it just controls for a time trend. So visually, you can see that pre-OPM, there's more inequality, and this is all relative to white men. More inequality, particularly for underrepresented men and women, underrepresented minority men and women. And there's more equality in OPM, though these are still less than 0, which indicates there is remaining inequality. And then after, there is some rising inequality again relative to white men. So you can see sort of the changes over time as people go in and out of OPM. And so if we think about specifically the blue dots to the red dots, a salary history ban, you would think would do very little for gender all by itself, but it could improve some of the racial, sort of lingering racial inequality that we see amongst the people in OPM. A lot of the gaps we see once underrepresented minority men and women come into OPM are coming from the inequality they were experiencing in the market before entering federal employment. So to just sort of reiterate that, to the extent yeah, to the extent there are carryover earnings disparities, the salary history band will probably serve to reduce those. I think that a lot of us who are now on the demand side of the market have reason to be concerned about this policy. So the literature that I highlighted showed that salary history bands do reduce overall pay levels, and they may serve to reduce the pay that we can offer. A lot of times we are meeting previous salaries, and as I showed, government already pays less than the private sector, and it does pay less than now, although on average, the government pays more than academic jobs. It pays less than a lot of academic jobs. And so we may struggle on the demand side with this ban, and we'll have, as I said, that this was implemented in January, or is passed in January. And I'm not even sure if it's implemented yet, but we're going to see that in the next couple of years, how this new policy affects us. So I think I talk too fast, as I usually do. There's one other policy that I think a lot of federal employees are encountering now, that I think is going to have a huge effect on who's working for the government, and could have positive effects if we sort of embrace the new COVID reality, and are able to hire more broadly than we used to. But there's been, I know, a lot of return to office mandates lately, and so that could have huge effects. I am personally very interested in that topic, but but have no expertise in it. So I'm going to sort of further advertise the seminar that will be happening next month on remote work. I don't think it's specifically about federal employment and remote work, but is more general. But is it, I think, going to be really important for the federal government. So
Right.
that
That's
is
it.
all I have. So
All right, thanks, Danny. So I think we can start our Q&A session now. So if you have I see we have a few questions in the chat, but if you have a question